In the marble lobby of a Manhattan hotel, Mason Reed only wanted to deliver an envelope and disappear. His jacket was old, the kind of coat nobody important would wear here. Lucas Vale, bodyguard to the hotel's CEO, stepped in front of him and laughed loud enough for investors nearby to hear. He called Mason a failure who did not belong near a red carpet. Mason said nothing. His eyes stayed calm, like water before a storm no one else could see coming. Then three strangers moved toward the CEO from behind, and Lucas understood whose path he had insulted. Stay until the very end, because that old worn jacket hides a past that will leave the entire hotel speechless. The Grand Meridian rose 40 stories above Manhattan, its lobby a cathedral of marble and gold light, the kind of place where every footstep seemed to echo with money. Amelia Grant stood near the center of it that evening, hosting a gathering of investors who held the future of her company in their carefully manicured hands. She had built the hotel chain from a single struggling property left to her by her father, and tonight was supposed to be the night that secured its next decade. Mason Reed had no interest in any of that. He moved through the revolving doors with the quiet economy of a man who had learned long ago not to waste motion. His jacket was faded at the shoulders, the kind of coat that had clearly survived more winters than anyone in that lobby could imagine surviving themselves. He was not there for champagne or conversation. He carried a single envelope, sealed, addressed only to Amelia Grant, and his only goal was to place it in her hands and walk back out into the cold. Lucas Vale saw him first. Lucas had the build of a man who spent 2 hours a day in a gym and 0 hours learning what real danger actually looked like. He wore a tailored suit that fit him the way armor fits a soldier who has never been to war, and he carried himself like he believed the title of bodyguard was something to be performed rather than earned. When his eyes landed on Mason's jacket, his mouth curled into the kind of smile that men wear when they mistake cruelty for confidence. He stepped directly into Mason's path, deliberately, making sure his voice carried far enough that the nearest cluster of investors turned to look. He asked Mason what exactly he thought he was doing in a building like this, dressed like that. Mason did not raise his voice. He said only that he had something for Miss Grant, something she needed to see before the night went any further. Lucas laughed, a short, performative bark meant for the audience rather than for Mason, and said a man who shopped at thrift stores had no business carrying anything important. Amelia, still mid-conversation with a financier from Chicago, caught the exchange from the corner of her eye. She did not yet understand who the stranger was, only that her own bodyguard was making a spectacle in front of the very people she needed to impress. She excused herself and began walking toward the commotion, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. Lucas pressed closer to Mason, reaching out to grip his shoulder, more theater than necessity, a way of proving to the room that he was handling the situation. Mason did not stumble. He did not raise a fist. He simply held Lucas's gaze, and something in that stillness made Lucas's hand falter for half a second before he pulled it back, covering the hesitation with another insult about second-hand coats and men who did not know their place. Mason asked, quietly enough that only Lucas and the man closest to them could hear, for one private minute with Amelia. He repeated that the envelope concerned her safety, not her schedule, not her investors, her safety. Lucas scoffed and waved toward the door, telling him to take his delivery and his rags somewhere else, then turned to summon hotel security with a flick of 2 fingers, satisfied with his own performance. It was in that exact moment, as Lucas postured for the crowd, that Mason's attention shifted past him entirely. Near the far end of the lobby, 3 men in matching gray uniforms stood just a little too still, watching Amelia with a kind of focused patience that had nothing to do with hotel maintenance. Mason's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, the way a man's focus sharpens when peace ends and old instincts return uninvited. He had spent years training himself to notice exactly this, the small inconsistencies that most people walked past without a second glance. A man standing too long near a column, a glance that lingered half a second too far. A posture that belonged to someone scanning a room rather than admiring it. None of it was dramatic. None of it would have meant anything to the investors sipping champagne only a few feet away. But to Mason it was as loud as an alarm, and it told him that whatever quiet life he had built for himself over the past several years was about to be interrupted, at least for one night, by the kind of responsibility he had never fully managed to set down. Hotel security arrived in the form of 2 large men in dark blazers, but Lucas waved them off, deciding he would rather finish humiliating Mason himself than share the credit. He turned back to the small audience that had gathered, raising his voice another notch, telling them they were watching exactly the kind of person who tried to sneak into events like this, hoping someone important would feel sorry for him. He said a man dressed in rags could not possibly be carrying anything worth a CEO's attention, that the whole thing was probably some scheme for money or attention. Amelia finally reached them, her expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and irritation. She did not enjoy scenes, especially not in front of investors who were already nervous about recent volatility in the hospitality market. She asked Lucas sharply what exactly was happening, and Lucas straightened, clearly pleased to have her attention, launching into an exaggerated account of how he had stopped a suspicious man from approaching her. Mason spoke directly to Amelia for the first time, his voice low and steady, cutting through Lucas's performance without raising in volume at all. He told her that if she did not read what was inside the envelope before the evening ended, she would be in danger. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man states a fact rather than a warning meant to frighten. Something in the simplicity of it made Amelia pause. Lucas, irritated that Mason had spoken past him, snatched the envelope out of Mason's hand before anyone could react. Mason told him calmly not to open it here, not in front of this many people. Lucas ignored him entirely, tearing the seal with a flourish meant to humiliate Mason publicly, certain he was about to expose some pathetic scam. Instead, several printed pages slid out. There were photographs taken from security camera angles around the hotel's lower levels, a hand-drawn diagram of the basement and parking structure, a printed timeline of Amelia's movements for the evening, and in the corner of one page, a small symbol that Lucas did not recognize, but that meant something very specific to anyone who had once worn a military uniform. Lucas stared at the pages, confused, insisting this was clearly some elaborate hoax meant to scare or extort the hotel. But Amelia had stepped closer, and her eyes had caught something Lucas missed entirely, a label on the diagram naming an internal service corridor that only her most senior security staff were supposed to know existed. Her stomach tightened. If a stranger off the street knew about that corridor, then either her security team had been compromised or someone inside it had been talking. Before she could ask anything further, Connor Blake appeared, smooth and composed, sliding into the moment with practiced ease. As head of hotel security, he reached for the envelope with an outstretched hand, telling Lucas to hand it over so he could verify its contents properly. Mason noticed the speed of the request, the way Connor's eyes moved across the documents, not with curiosity but with urgency, as if he needed to know exactly how much had already been seen. Connor had spent years cultivating exactly this reputation, the dependable face of security who could calm a room with a single reassuring sentence. He had been trusted with keys to every restricted corridor in the building, trusted with passwords to systems most employees never even knew existed, and he had used every bit of that trust to build something far darker than anyone around him could have imagined. Mason recognized the type immediately, the kind of man who had learned that the easiest way to steal something was to first become the person everyone relied upon to protect it. Mason said nothing about his suspicion. He simply watched the small details, the slight tremor in Connor's fingers, the way his feet had shifted to angle his body between Amelia and the diagram, the quick flick of his gaze toward the exit nearest the service elevators. Then, leaning toward Amelia so only she could hear, Mason said 5 words that would change the rest of her night. He told her not to take her private elevator tonight. Amelia turned to Connor and Lucas, demanding an explanation for how a stranger off the street could possibly know the layout of a corridor reserved for senior security personnel. Connor recovered quickly, suggesting that the man might be a former employee with a grudge, or worse, someone actively surveilling the property for criminal purposes. He said it with enough conviction that Lucas latched onto the theory immediately, eager to reframe himself as the one who had caught a dangerous threat rather than the one who had been embarrassed by him. Mason did not argue the point. Instead, he simply turned and named 3 things wrong with the lobby around them, things no one else in the room had noticed. A waiter near the bar wore no name badge, unlike every other member of staff. A service door near the east wall had been propped shut with a luggage cart instead of left clear as fire code required, and a hallway camera that should have been angled toward the main corridor had been quietly rotated several degrees off its standard position sometime in the last hour. Amelia's breath caught. Those were not guesses. Those were precise, verifiable details that her own security team had failed to report to her at all. She glanced toward Connor, whose jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, though he masked it quickly by feigning concern. Lucas, embarrassed at being outdone twice in the span of 10 minutes, demanded that Mason prove he was not simply some lucky guesser, or a man who had memorized the building beforehand for some scheme of his own. Mason refused to perform for him. He said only that he had once done work where a single second of carelessness meant someone did not come home, and that he had no interest in proving anything to a man more concerned with his own reputation than with the woman he was supposed to be protecting. The words landed harder than Mason intended them to, and for a moment Lucas had nothing to say at all. Amelia studied Mason carefully, asking what kind of work could possibly require that level of precision. Mason looked at her evenly and told her that the answer to that question mattered far less than whether she survived the night, and that he intended to make sure she did. It was not arrogance in his voice. It was simply certainty, the kind that came from a man who had said similar things before and meant them every time. While the conversation held the room's attention, Connor slid his phone from his pocket and typed quickly, angling his body so no one could see the screen. Mason, standing slightly behind him, caught the reflection in a polished glass partition along the wall, just long enough to register movement, urgency, and the brief flash of a message sent rather than received. He said nothing about it yet. There was no proof, not the kind that would convince a room full of skeptical strangers, only the accumulating weight of small details that all pointed in the same uncomfortable direction. But Mason understood in that quiet, watchful way of his that whatever plan had been set in motion was no longer a threat sitting on the horizon. It had already begun moving, somewhere beneath their feet, closer with every passing minute than anyone in that glittering lobby realized. The event shifted to the private ballroom on the second floor, where the real business of the evening was meant to happen, contracts discussed over champagne, handshakes sealed under crystal chandeliers. Amelia had no choice but to continue. Investors did not wait politely while a CEO untangled a personal crisis, and walking away now would raise more questions than it answered. She moved through the doors with practiced composure even as her mind kept circling back to the corridor diagram and the rotated camera. Mason was told firmly to leave the premises. He did not argue. He simply stepped to the edge of the hallway just outside the ballroom, positioning himself where he could see the room without standing inside it, drawing no attention to himself at all. Lucas, still smarting from the earlier exchange, grew visibly agitated that Mason had not actually disappeared the way he had been ordered to. Connor, meanwhile, quietly instructed 2 members of his staff to lock several of the side doors leading out of the ballroom, citing event security as the reason. Mason watched the motion from his position in the hallway and understood immediately what it meant. It was not security, it was containment. Someone was narrowing the number of paths Amelia could take if she needed to run. Down near the service corridor, 3 men who had blended into the building as technical staff began moving with quiet purpose toward the private elevator bank, the one Mason had specifically warned Amelia not to use. Mason shifted his own position, careful not to startle the guests milling nearby, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who had learned that panic spreads faster than danger itself. Lucas intercepted him again, this time with more force, grabbing the collar of Mason's jacket and yanking him half a step backward, sneering that the coat probably came from a donation bin and that Mason had no business lingering anywhere near this floor. Mason's hand moved once, small and precise, and Lucas's grip released before he even understood what had happened, a flicker of pain crossing his wrist that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. Amelia, glancing over at exactly the wrong moment, caught the motion and the look on Lucas's face, and something inside her recalibrated. Whatever Mason was, he was not the helpless stranger Lucas kept insisting he was. The lights in the ballroom flickered once, then again, drawing a ripple of nervous laughter from guests who assumed it was nothing more than an electrical hiccup. A low metallic groan echoed from somewhere near the service exit, the kind of sound a heavy door makes when it is forced rather than opened properly. Mason's body shifted before his mind had even finished processing the noise, an old instinct surfacing instantly. He reached for Amelia and pulled her half a step backward, just enough that the man who lunged from the shadow of the doorway missed her entirely, stumbling past the space where she had been standing only a heartbeat before. Lucas froze completely, his mouth slightly open, the realization crashing over him all at once that Mason had reacted faster than every trained member of the security detail combined, faster than Lucas himself, faster than anyone in that entire glittering room. The man who had lunged toward Amelia wore the same gray technical uniform as the others Mason had spotted earlier, and he recovered fast, pivoting to grab for her again. Mason did not strike with anything dramatic. He simply caught the man's wrist, redirected the momentum, and let the man's own weight carry him down onto the carpet, pinning him there with a controlled, economical motion that drew gasps rather than admiration from the surrounding guests. Panic rippled through the ballroom immediately, voices rising, glasses dropping, the elegant calm of the evening shattering in an instant. Mason's voice cut through it, short and commanding, telling everyone nearby to get low and stay away from the windows. People listened without question, the kind of instinctive obedience that comes when someone speaks with absolute certainty rather than fear. Lucas stood frozen for several seconds, his brain still struggling to process what his eyes had just witnessed. A second attacker emerged from near the bar, a small blade hidden along his forearm, moving fast toward Amelia's position. Mason grabbed a silver serving tray from a nearby table, using it to deflect the strike before kicking the blade away beneath a row of chairs in one fluid motion. Mason pulled Amelia firmly toward a thick stone column near the center of the room, a position that offered real cover rather than the illusion of safety. Lucas, desperate to prove he still had value, finally moved, but he was too slow and too unfocused, taking a hard blow to the stomach from the third attacker that doubled him over and dropped him to one knee. Mason crossed the distance in 2 strides and intercepted a follow-up strike that would have done serious damage to Lucas, deflecting it cleanly despite everything Lucas had said to him only minutes earlier. Lucas looked up at him, humiliated, gasping for air, unable to form a single word of gratitude or apology in that moment. Connor, who had been hovering near the edge of the chaos, suddenly grabbed Amelia by the arm under the pretense of escorting her to safety, claiming he was leading her toward backup security stationed near the hallway. Mason caught the direction immediately and recognized it as wrong, the opposite of every safe route the building actually offered. He said it plainly, loud enough for Amelia to hear clearly over the noise, that Connor was the one who had betrayed her. Connor's expression shifted instantly, the practiced calm falling away to reveal something colder underneath. He barked an order to the men still standing, telling them the plan had changed, that they would take Amelia down to the parking structure instead. In the scramble that followed, Amelia was pulled roughly into the dark service hallway leading toward the basement levels, her voice cut off by Connor's hand before she could call out fully. Mason bent down and lifted his jacket from the floor where it had fallen during the struggle, pulling it back over his shoulders slowly, his expression now entirely different from the calm, tired stranger who had walked through the lobby doors that evening. Mason moved after them, but he did not run blindly. Years of training had taught him that haste killed more people than hesitation ever did, and instead of sprinting recklessly down the corridor, he calculated the layout of the building in his head, predicting which routes a group trying to avoid attention would actually take. Lucas staggered up from the floor and followed, still wincing, but this time he stayed quiet, listening rather than performing. Mason told him to switch off his radio entirely, explaining that the security frequency had almost certainly been compromised given how easily the attackers had moved through supposedly secure areas. Lucas stared at him, stunned that a man in a thrift store jacket understood protective protocol better than the entire professional team he worked alongside every day. As they moved through a narrow service hallway, Mason noticed a small embroidered symbol on a bag one of the attackers had dropped earlier, a marking he recognized from a private military contracting group that had developed a reputation years ago for taking jobs other mercenaries refused. Lucas finally asked the question that had been building in him since the lobby, asking flatly who exactly Mason was. Mason answered simply that he was a man who used to bring his teammates home. Nothing more dramatic than that, no embellishment, no attempt to impress. As they continued through the corridor, he mentioned, briefly and without self-pity, that he had once served as a Navy SEAL before leaving the military after a mission that ended badly, a mission that cost him a close friend and ultimately convinced him that his fighting days needed to end. Since then, he had lived quietly, repairing machinery and small engines for a living, raising his daughter alone, avoiding any situation that might pull him back into the kind of violence he had promised himself he would leave behind. Grace, his daughter, was mentioned only once, in a single sentence, when Mason said softly that he had promised her he would never raise his hands against anyone unless it meant saving a life that would otherwise be lost. Lucas absorbed all of this in silence, his earlier arrogance dissolving into something closer to shame mixed with genuine respect. He had spent the entire evening mocking a man who had clearly seen things Lucas could not even imagine, judged him entirely by the condition of his jacket rather than the weight of what he had survived. There was no time to dwell on it, though, because Mason had already located their destination. Through a small reinforced window near the end of the corridor, he spotted the entrance to the underground parking structure where the hotel kept its fleet of armored vehicles, the kind reserved for visiting dignitaries and high-value transport. The heavy steel door leading inside had been left slightly ajar, just enough to confirm exactly where Connor had taken Amelia, and just enough to tell Mason that whatever happened next would happen fast, and it would happen in the dark. For a brief moment, Mason allowed himself to think of Grace, picturing her asleep at home, unaware that her father had been pulled back into a world he had promised her he would leave behind for good. He thought of the quiet mornings they shared, the small engines he repaired for neighbors who never asked questions about his past, the ordinary peace he had built so carefully out of the wreckage of everything that came before. None of that peace mattered if he let a woman die in a parking garage because he had chosen comfort over responsibility. He pushed the thought aside, steadied his breathing, and focused entirely on the door in front of him. Down in the dim concrete belly of the parking structure, Connor had already begun his real demand. He pushed a tablet toward Amelia, displaying a transfer agreement that would hand controlling interest of a massive development project to a shell company Connor had quietly built over the past 2 years. He told her almost casually that signing would end the night peacefully, that none of this needed to become anything worse than an inconvenient business transaction. Amelia stared at him, finally understanding the full shape of what was happening. This had never been a simple kidnapping. It was a hostile, calculated theft disguised as chaos, designed to look like the random violence of strangers rather than the betrayal of someone she had trusted with the safety of her entire company. Connor, almost proud of his own cleverness, admitted that he had sold details of her schedule and security routines to outside contacts for a price that would have set him up comfortably for the rest of his life. Above them, Mason and Lucas reached the heavy door leading into the structure, only to find it secured by an electronic lock that had been engaged from somewhere inside. Lucas immediately wanted to force it open through sheer strength, but Mason stopped him, warning that a forced breach might trigger a silent alarm wired to alert the men inside, giving them time to hurt Amelia before help could reach her. Mason scanned the surrounding area methodically, eventually locating an alternate route through a mechanical room that housed the building's cooling systems. The space was narrow, dusty, and uncomfortable, and Lucas, for the first time in his career as a bodyguard, experienced genuine fear rather than the manufactured swagger he usually performed for an audience. He crawled through the cramped passage behind Mason, his expensive suit catching on exposed pipes, his confidence stripped down to something far more honest. Mason noticed that the corridor's security cameras were looping the same few seconds of footage repeatedly, a clear sign of tampering. He draped his own jacket briefly over a motion sensor mounted near the ceiling, blocking its detection just long enough for both men to slip past undetected. Lucas, watching this happen, finally asked why Mason still bothered carrying such an old, worn-out coat everywhere he went. Mason answered quietly that the jacket had belonged to a friend, a teammate who never made it home from their final deployment together, and that wearing it was the only way he knew how to keep carrying him forward. Lucas fell silent immediately, the weight of his earlier mockery landing on him all at once, the realization that he had spent the entire night ridiculing something Mason held more sacred than anything else he owned. They reached the edge of the parking level moments later, and through a gap in the concrete pillars, they finally saw her. Amelia stood surrounded by 3 armed men in the dim yellow light, her posture rigid but unbroken, refusing to give Connor the satisfaction of watching her hands shake as she stared down at the tablet he was still holding out toward her. Lucas wanted to charge in immediately, his protective instincts finally awakening at the worst possible moment for patience. Mason held him back with a firm hand on his shoulder, quietly mapping out the exact position of each armed man, explaining in low whispers where the gaps in their attention would briefly open if they waited just a little longer. Lucas, still operating on adrenaline rather than discipline, did not fully absorb the instructions. He shifted his weight wrong against a metal support beam, and the sound rang out sharper than either of them expected in the concrete silence of the structure. One of the armed men spun toward the noise instantly, spotting them before they had a chance to retreat into the shadows. Within seconds, Lucas was pinned against a pillar with a weapon pressed against his ribs, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by genuine terror. Connor turned and laughed at him, calling him a decorative bodyguard who looked impressive in photographs, but who had never actually been tested by anything real in his entire career. The words cut deeper than any physical blow could have, and something in Lucas seemed to crumble under the weight of them. Mason remained still, refusing to let panic dictate his movements even with Lucas's life suddenly hanging in the balance. He used the darkness, the distant drip of water from an overhead pipe, and the dull reflection off a parked vehicle's windshield to disguise his position and draw attention elsewhere. Moving with deliberate quiet, he closed the distance to the nearest attacker and disabled him without a sound, repositioning instantly before the others could register what had happened. Lucas watched the entire sequence unfold from where he stood pinned against the pillar, stunned by how little wasted motion there was in anything Mason did. There was no posturing, no unnecessary force, nothing performed for an audience, Only precise economical action aimed solely at ending the threat as quickly and quietly as possible. It was nothing like the version of strength Lucas had spent years pretending to embody. Amelia caught sight of Mason emerging silently from the shadows directly behind Connor, his presence completely unnoticed by the man still gripping her arm. For just a moment, hope flickered across her face, carefully hidden beneath the calm mask she had been forcing herself to maintain since the moment Connor first revealed his betrayal. Connor, sensing something shift in the air around him, turned slowly and found himself staring directly into Mason's eyes. Whatever confidence Connor had carried into that parking structure evaporated instantly, replaced by the sudden, sickening understanding that the quiet stranger in the worn jacket was not some random obstacle he had underestimated, but the single greatest threat his entire plan had never accounted for. Connor barked an order, and the remaining man holding Lucas shoved him aside, moving instead to deal with the more immediate threat standing behind his employer. Mason did not aim to kill anyone that night. He never had, not since leaving the service, holding to a discipline that had outlasted every uniform he had ever worn. Instead, he relied on joint locks, controlled leverage, and a thorough understanding of the cramped concrete environment around them, turning the parking structure itself into a tool against the men trying to use it as their stronghold. One attacker swung a heavy baton toward Mason's head, and Mason simply stepped aside at the last possible instant, letting the man's own momentum carry him forward into the side of a parked vehicle with enough force to crumple him onto the pavement. Another came at him with a blade, and Mason caught the seatbelt strap hanging from an open car door, looping it around the man's wrist and yanking it taut, locking his arm uselessly against the frame of the vehicle. Lucas managed to scramble free during the confusion, bruised but functional, blood trickling from a shallow cut along his hairline. Amelia, watching the chaos unfold around her, used the brief lapse in Connor's attention to slip her phone beneath the seat of the nearest car, quietly activating its recording function, capturing every word Connor had spoken since the moment he revealed his plan. Connor's composure finally shattered as he watched his hired men fall one after another, his carefully built scheme collapsing in real time before his eyes. In desperation, he grabbed Amelia and pulled her in front of himself, using her as a shield against whatever Mason intended to do next, his voice cracking as he shouted that this was not how any of this was supposed to go. Mason stopped completely, his voice dropping even lower than before, steady and absolutely without anger. He told Connor plainly to let her go. Connor laughed, though the sound came out thin and unconvincing, insisting that Mason was nothing now, a retired nobody with no team behind him, no weapon in his hand, no real authority to back up anything he said. Mason answered without hesitation, his tone carrying the weight of a man who had spent years proving exactly the opposite. He said that a man like him never needed power or rank to protect somebody innocent, that the willingness alone had always been enough, in every mission, in every quiet year since. It was Lucas, finally, who found his usefulness. He rose unsteadily to his feet and shouted Connor's name sharply, just enough to pull his attention away from Mason for one single, critical second. That second was all Mason needed. He moved forward in a single fluid motion, stripping the weapon from Connor's grip and forcing him down onto the concrete with controlled, practiced precision, ending the confrontation before Connor could even register what had happened. The parking structure fell into sudden, heavy silence, broken only by ragged breathing and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Lucas looked down at the old jacket lying crumpled on the pavement where it had slipped from Mason's shoulders during the struggle, and for the first time all evening he understood exactly what that worn fabric actually represented. It was not a sign of poverty or failure. It was a quiet symbol of survival, carried by a man who had given everything to protect people who would never even know his name. Amelia steadied herself against the side of a parked vehicle, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline finally giving way to the full weight of everything that had nearly happened to her. She looked at Mason, this stranger who had walked into her lobby carrying nothing but an envelope and a quiet warning, and found herself unable to fully articulate the depth of what she owed him. Words felt insufficient against the scale of it, so she said nothing at all, simply allowing herself, for the first time that night, to breathe without fear pressing against every thought. In the distance, faint at first but growing steadily louder, the sound of approaching sirens began echoing through the concrete corridors of the parking structure, cutting through the night air toward the building where everything had finally come to an end. Real police and proper hotel security finally arrived, flooding the parking structure with flashlights and radio chatter, restoring some sense of order to a night that had spiraled completely out of control. Amelia retrieved her phone from beneath the car seat and handed it directly to the lead officer, the recording inside containing every confession Connor had made about selling her schedule and orchestrating the entire scheme from within her own company. Connor was placed in restraints along with the two men still capable of standing, their carefully built plan reduced to nothing more than evidence bags and statements given under harsh fluorescent light. Amelia turned to Mason once the immediate chaos had settled, asking quietly how he had known about any of this before it ever happened. Mason explained simply that an old friend, still connected to certain protective circles, had noticed her name surface within a network that quietly bought and sold security information for high-profile targets. He had come only to warn her, intending to deliver the envelope and leave immediately afterward, never planning to stay for more than the few minutes it would take to hand it over. The envelope, it turned out, also contained a detailed list of specific vulnerabilities within the hotel's existing security systems, gaps that had clearly been exploited or ignored for far too long. Amelia realized, looking at the documents again under the harsh light of the parking structure, that Mason had wanted absolutely nothing from her in return. Not money, not recognition, not even basic credit for what he had done. Lucas approached slowly, his earlier arrogance entirely gone, replaced by something far more humble. He struggled to find the right words, eventually managing a quiet apology for everything he had said about Mason's jacket, about his appearance, about assuming a man's worth based on the condition of his clothing rather than anything beneath it. Mason did not make a show of accepting the apology. He simply told Lucas that the most useful lesson he could take from tonight was learning to look at a person before looking at what they were wearing. Lucas nodded, and for the first time since Mason had walked through those revolving doors, the gesture carried real, unguarded sincerity rather than performance. Amelia offered Mason a position as a security consultant for her entire company, explaining that she needed someone capable of genuinely protecting people rather than simply looking the part for cameras and investors. Mason hesitated at first, telling her honestly that he had built a quiet life specifically to avoid situations exactly like the one he had just survived. Amelia did not pressure him. She told him only that she needed someone who understood real protection, someone who did not require applause or recognition to do the job correctly. As the conversation settled into something calmer, Mason looked down at his jacket, now draped back over his arm, and thought quietly of the promise he had made long ago to never turn away from danger when someone's life genuinely depended on it. Several weeks passed, and the Grand Meridian underwent a complete overhaul of its security infrastructure, every camera egg cooked, every access point reassigned, every gap that had once allowed betrayal to slip through quietly sealed away for good. Lucas no longer carried himself with the same hollow swagger he once wore like a second uniform. He began training again from the very beginning, this time under the quiet, unglamorous guidance Mason offered without ever making a public show of mentorship. Amelia met Mason one afternoon in a small, quiet cafe tucked inside the hotel, far removed from the marble grandeur of the main lobby where everything between them had first gone so wrong. There was no distance left between them now, no separation between powerful CEO and anonymous stranger, only two people who had survived something together and come out the other side with a clearer understanding of each other. She thanked him, not only for saving her life that night, but for revealing the corruption quietly rotting inside the company she had spent years building from almost nothing. Mason told her plainly that he was no hero, only a man who refused to turn his back when he saw someone in genuine danger, a distinction that mattered greatly to him even if the rest of the world rarely noticed the difference. Amelia slid a flexible consulting contract across the table, one designed to let Mason continue protecting people without sacrificing the quiet private life he had worked so hard to build for himself and his daughter. Mason accepted, but only under one firm condition: no publicity, no interviews, no transformation of his past into a marketing story meant to flatter the hotel brand. Amelia agreed immediately, understanding exactly why that boundary mattered so much to him. Lucas walked over just as their conversation wound down, carrying Mason's old jacket in both hands with a level of care he would never have shown it weeks earlier. He hung it gently on a clean hook near the entrance, treating the worn fabric with a quiet respect that had nothing to do with its appearance and everything to do with what it represented. Mason looked at him and offered only a small, simple nod, the kind exchanged between men who finally understood each other. Outside, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent to the quiet reckoning that had taken place inside one of its grandest buildings. Investors who had fled the chaos that night eventually returned, reassured by new security measures and a CEO who carried herself with a steadier kind of confidence than before. None of them ever learned the full truth of what had happened in that parking structure, and Mason preferred it that way. Recognition had never been the point. It had never once been the reason he did any of it. The story closed quietly, the way most real ones do, far from headlines or public recognition. Mason walked out of the lobby that evening still wearing the very same old jacket, the fabric just as worn as it had always been, but no one in that building would ever dare laugh at it again. What mattered in the end was never the condition of what a person wore, but the quiet, unwavering willingness to stand between danger and the people who could not protect themselves. A truth that the Grand Meridian and everyone who had witnessed that long night inside it would carry forward for a very long time to come. If you enjoy stories about quiet single fathers who are underestimated yet silently protect others, follow along for the next story.